All right. So for our next session, we're going to talk a little bit more about pay and equity, pay transparency, and equity communication in particular. So just kind of backdrop here, as we all know, a lot of pay transparency laws went into effect the past few years, and that's really changed the dynamic, especially here in the US, about how we think about pay and communicating pay to employees, and has kind of created a wide range of like opportunities and issues. I think most of us probably pretty excited about that development, but there's a lot of implications for us. And then kind of on the equity side of things, interestingly, like that doesn't, equity has not fallen into those pay transparency laws, and especially for those of us that work at startups, equity is a big part of total compensation, so we want to talk a little bit about how that fits in here. And I think in particular, we're interested in how we communicate some of these things to employees. I think one other thing on my mind in particular about startup equity, obviously startups have gone through kind of a bit of a roller coaster the past few years where valuations went really high. We brought in a lot of people from outside of the startup space into startups who maybe didn't know how to understand their equity and what that actually meant. And then we saw a lot of valuations stall or go down a little bit, right? And I think equity is always very hard to communicate to employees. It's like a very complex topic. I think it's even harder when you see this roller coaster and you're like, I don't even know how to look at this lottery ticket that I have and think about decisions, financial decisions for myself around that. So kind of framing the conversation there, I will let you both kick it off here by introducing yourselves and similar to last session, give us like your take on the state of the pay and equity space in startups right now.
Hi, everyone. I feel like that was a really hard panel to follow. I'm Yin. I'm the founder and CEO of Pulley, and we help over 4,000 companies manage their cap table and equity programs. So we help fast-growing tech companies like Coda, Linear, as well as more traditional companies like Specialty Bikes that want to give everyone that helps build a company a piece of the company. I think what we've seen in the last few years, maybe narrowing the conversation to tech companies, is that the way that folks on the team think about equity has changed so much. When you think about 2021 era, everything was going up and to the right. And there was a belief that if you got equity within the company, it was almost a guaranteed lottery ticket. And I think what you've seen on the other side is for some of these companies that have gone public, where their valuations have crashed significantly, late-stage companies are pushing back the timeline to when they're going public. There's a lot of confusion on how someone should even think about equity. Pulley today works with a lot of early-stage companies in particular, and we see such a broad range in how founders are even communicating equity and how people value the equity, especially now when you have such a remote and international workforce. So I'm really excited to, I think, dig more into this topic.
Caitlin, CEO, co-founder of Pequity. We do compensation management, so broad-based programs, but also equity programs, helping do your once, twice, hopefully not 4 times a year comp cycles for everyone. We have a monthly comp cycle going on our tool right now. God bless that HR team. But we see a lot in the space. We also have a lot of software that helps with employee education, so merit letters as well as employee portals. And interestingly, hopefully for the group, I come from the comp space. I spent 10 years running compensation teams and programs at companies like Google, Cruise Automation, Instacart. So I got to experience the first iteration of a lot of these laws. And if I may take a little liberty, I'd love to actually quickly poll the room, because I love doing this, but by raise of hands, how many people in this room, your companies have adopted pay transparency laws, like publishing salaries where it's required? How many companies in this room have adopted like a global policy? So you do it everywhere regardless of whether it's required. Okay, fewer hands. How many of you are publishing both salary and equity? Okay, no one. Okay, so
Half a hand, I think.
Half a hand, yeah. I think that in my opinion, I think that wraps up what we are seeing broadly across a lot of our companies. Everyone knows that we have to adopt pay transparency because now it's this federal requirement. But what I find interesting about the adoption we work with our companies is that it comes actually down to the spirit of these laws. And it's not something that's talked about a lot, and I think it causes HR people a lot of trauma because What really is happening, I'm a founder, I've been on the comp side of house. I want to hire the best employees for $1 more than my competitors. That's it, right? Like, I'm looking at these spreadsheets trying to figure out the economics of like, how do I make this engine run? When I go to fundraise, I have to figure out what will VCs look at from efficiency. And I have these metrics in mind, but there's real humans attached to those dollars. And that's what you are looking at every day. And you're like, Caitlin, we have really good talent. They have to know where to go. There's an economic decision they're making. They have families. There's decisions that they're making. And I think with a lot of these laws, especially around equity, talking about the lottery ticket that we're looking at, we forget the spirit of what this is trying to achieve, which is equaling the economic playing field. And it's something that I think causes trauma where from a founder, exec, or any sort of early stage startup perspective, especially with equity compensation, we don't publish it because we're like, well, why would we? It's volatile. The courts, if you go to do a pay equity lawsuit, hope none of you do, equity's not part of it, actually. It's very rare to pull that in. It's only cash compensation that gets considered. And it's because it's so volatile. The courts actually recognize that it's a lottery ticket, and so there it shouldn't be valued. But that's antithetical to what we're trying to sell as a startup. So I think there's a lot of things I can get into, and I could geek out on this all day, but I'd love to even talk about the spirit of it, because I think it'll solve many of the challenges that we, as HR people, face in getting our leaders and our employees and our managers to adopt these things.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that last piece is particularly interesting. Like, that's one of the values of working at startups, right? Like, we all join these companies that are going to go on a roller coaster ride, and like, you know, we get compensation that might not always be the same as you get at a Fortune 500 company from a cash standpoint, but you know, you do get this equity, and that is like a large part of the upside of this space. So I think that's particularly why, I mean, I've had conversations with a lot of people in startups recently who are now, you know, going into their new jobs and valuing their equity at 0 right now, which I think is a bad thing for the industry, because we need people to understand equity and how it's valued and buy into that lottery ticket. I am interested in hearing from both of you how your own companies approach pay, like communicating pay and equity. I mean, inevitable question here, but like you see a lot of companies, you see the mistakes. How do you do it?
I can jump in. So I can talk about it from Pulley's perspective and also some of the data that we see on our platform. For companies that I would say until maybe Series B, one of the common patterns we notice is that they oftentimes give employees a choice between what is the split that you want between equity and cash compensation. So option 1 would be high equity, lower cash. Option 2 would be mid-equity, mid-cash. And then typically from a framework perspective, you want to peg that so that you can have a way to explain it to folks that are asking, where you could say, we give in the 50th percentile when it comes to cash comp, but we want to give in the 90th percentile when it comes to equity comp. Because we know as a startup, you can't compete on cash comp against the open AIs that are paying 4x what is market, but what you have the chance to get, and again, no guarantee of success, is a small piece of something that could be much bigger. You can get a small piece of OpenAI before it was OpenAI, and then you have option 3, which is high cash. And I think that kind of this model that we've seen, it's becoming more and more common because it does give the candidate on the other side, I think, more optionality when it comes to choosing the package that better fits with what they need in their life today. And I would say like one of the things that's been interesting in the last few years is how do you even explain the value of equity when it itself is a confusing topic. When you get equity, you don't get direct shares most of the time when it comes to a company. You get options. You need to buy your options. So if you are getting $100,000 worth of these options and it costs $50K, well, there's a delta. And I think in terms of like the teams I think that are best able to start on a right foot with candidates and future co-workers at your company, you're really transparent about this information. And I think this push for transparency is actually really key. V1, I would say, is folks would just share like, hey, you get 100K of equity without any other information around like what is a strike price, what does that mean in terms of ownership, what does it mean in terms of the company valuation. And in some ways you could say like maybe that benefits the company more because there's such a big information asymmetry. But the downside of that is it doesn't build trust for the people that you really want on your team to help you build this company together. So increasingly, I think at Pulley and I think within a lot of companies, we see that greater trust movement.
I just wanted to step in. Your point around giving employees a choice is something I've definitely seen. I
I think that's such a great point because the other thing we've seen is that if you're hiring internationally, international employees tend not to make the trade-off of going with option 3. And then there's also complications around how do you track this for future pay cycles where you want to make sure folks are within the band when they've made that explicit trade-off perhaps between equity as well as salary. So I think it definitely complicates it. And I think with any of the equity discussions, it ends up being not as easy as what we would hope.
Yeah. Small plug to track it. Pequity will help track it. I agree with that. When I was in my consulting days for it, we actually came into several startups that did trade-offs, and the heartbreaking thing actually was that you can't fix, when people do trade-offs, you can't go back and grant more equity. That's illegal. And moms were the number one to usually choose cash, and they were often left behind by the success of a company. And that's heartbreaking for me, both as a woman in tech, but also coming in to fix it and having those conversations with those employees, like you're just left behind from the success here. Very hard. For our company, I involved my employees in the decision. I was like, we're a comp company. They see data all the time. They're implementing everyone's comp cycles all the time. They know what's happening. So like, what do you guys want to do? Interestingly, even at a comp tech startup, my employees did not want full transparency. I offered to them to give access to everyone's like equity, everyone's salaries. Like you can see mine, you can see the founders, like everything. They didn't want it. And I was like, okay, like why is that? And it is because it's so personal. It's so emotional to them. And they feel this sway and this ability to negotiate, and there's this like protection that they're seeking from it. And I think that's it was an interesting data point for me to even see. And so actually going back to the spirit of it, when I think about like true pay transparency, and I coach a lot of people when they ask me about this, I actually think it comes down to not just the amounts. Like I actually get very annoyed when I see people, they're like, oh, I'm in compliance, and they have this broad range. And I'm like, well, how do I know that you're not just like paying like all the men, and to be very general and pedantic here, all the white men are at the top and all the minority females are at the bottom? How do I know? How do I know you're not doing that? Because one of the predominant holdbacks for many minorities in tech especially is actually underleveling and undertitling. And that's what will impact comp more than anything. And so I actually think pay transparency has to be paired, and this is unfortunate for us in the room because it's a lot of work for us, the education that goes into how do we make promotion decisions? How do we make leveling decisions? When I get to a comp cycle, if you have a merit matrix, do you publish that to your employees? Do I tell you that we are targeting a 3% increase this year? Here's the spread around our ratings. Are we at that stage yet? A lot of companies are not. But how can you or any of us as employees go into a business, and if you're offered one wage, how do you know what you can influence if you don't know how the machine works? And so pay transparency as publishing ranges, great. It's a very strong first step, but I think to actually solve for what I think the spirit is, which is to give equal negotiating power to our employees to combat the obviously stronger opposition, which is the company who owns the salary, who can fire these employees, who have all that control, you're basically going to have to provide much more upfront education beyond just here's a dollar amount. It's how does this dollar amount get applied after I'm in the company, or how do I get even leveled into this dollar amount?
Yeah, I'm really curious, like maybe a show of hands. How many of you guys in the room provide pay ranges for different levels on the team? How many of you also provide equity ranges for the different levels? So typically we've seen much fewer hands that get raised because I think there's also a reality of it's far harder to explain that equity component. If you are an AI engineer, you will get far more equity than you will get if you're in customer success, because that is what the market is also demanding today. And equity ranges we've also seen just adjusts more. Getting equity as employee 1 versus employee 10 is such a steep drop-off. And being able to explain why that's still equitable because you took on more risk when you were literally employee 1 building that company, to the person that joined was like, wait, but I also took on a lot of risk when I'm employee 10, I think ends up being far harder.
I have another question here from your own experiences. So obviously a lot of people here, they know their own companies really well, their own cultures and philosophies. The advantage that you both have is you see a wide breadth of what's going on across companies right now. Are there any particular trends that you're seeing from the past year or two on pay, or really, let's go broad across this whole topic area? Anything that you're excited about, trends that you're excited about, and trends that you're like, oh no, here's another thing that we're about to do wrong?
Oh, that's a big question. I mean, I love seeing how creative our peers in the space get with this. I think we're all trying to solve the problem. We're trying to solve it within the nuance of our own business and what our leaders allow and international law and like the comfort of our employees. I feel very excited by companies that are testing the waters on some of these things where they're like publishing their like, oh, like Buffer, you can go in and see very open, they were the first ones to do it, right?
Yes.
And there's other companies that have calculators that you can go in and you can actually visually play with. I think that those are interesting and cool. When I think of pay transparency, it's a spectrum, and I think we're at still the very opaque, not very transparent side of the spectrum. Like true pay transparency is like we would all know what everyone's paid in the room, right? Like I'd be able to walk in and be like, I know exactly what's going on here, and I know how I'm going to move up. I have perfect information. That doesn't exist. So I think companies that are inching that module closer to transparency excites me, but there is a lot of downfalls with it because what I see happening is that we still have to make exceptions and calls as startups, especially small startups. There's always going to be that one person who doesn't fit in the range. There's always going to be that one person who we have to give that sign on to keep. They're critical to the business, and that throws everything off. And there's special circumstances that we can't talk about. Like we know when people go on medical leaves or they're on a performance plan, and people around them might be aware that they're not performing well and they're still very well paid. And they're like, what are you doing about it? And you're like, I literally can't talk about that. Pay transparency opens that up. And so I do think that there's going to be not just amazing players that do really well. There's going to be martyrs who fall to these laws who we're going to watch very visibly be humiliated. And we're all trying to avoid that. But the sessions that like we have here today, I think will be very helpful. And I do think that the companies who are taking it and tackling it head on, there is a period of time, it's a very precious and limited period of time, where courts and employees, because this is so new, they will be more forgiving. I think once people have started to figure it out more and you start to late adopt it and you're still, you're like, oh, I'm gonna wait to see someone else figure it out and then you try and you fall, that's gonna be where we see the true disgrace happen. So I think it's better to be on the forefront really pushing it.
I'd say one thing tactically we've seen more of is longer term vests for larger equity grants. And maybe this is just within the segment of some of the tech companies we work with. I think there is still an appetite for folks to get equity, even if it's a lottery ticket you don't know how it's going to perceive. Because of the belief, especially if you're joining early, you want to be able to be a bigger owner. And I think on the company side, to be able to justify it, great, then you need to stay and contribute more to the company. This to me feels like a case where you can actually align the incentive of the individual with what the company also is trying to aim for, which is you want a group of folks that's really vested, but also understanding equity is a fixed resource. You can't give more than 100% equity. For someone to get more, that means everyone else at the company is getting diluted as well. And I think that ends up being a way to balance some of the trade-offs.
Awesome. I'd imagine we have a decent number of questions here. I want to go ahead and turn it over to see, got some awesome experts here, if you have any tactical questions for them.
I do. This is a selfish one. So have you seen any companies do really well with equity compensation? Not equal compensation, equitable compensation.
What would be your definition of equitable?
More reparations focused?
So we, with the way that we've constructed the software for Pequity, you can run comp cycles, like all the amazing stuff you do in a spreadsheet. We also can run pay regression tests in the middle of your comp cycle, which is invaluable. I love doing it. And I think that's one big place where you can see that work well. But the companies where I loved it, like regression tests do one thing, which is just test like a statistical value for peer and pay medians. I think that the companies that have the most equitable compensation pay attention to the other signals. It's things like velocity of male to female promos, velocity of merit increase over time. Interestingly, when we were at Google, they did tons of tests. Like we had this huge people analyst team that did a lot of fantastic things. And the thing with pay disparity is it's not like there's we think of this like mustache monocled man in the background twisting trying to mess with numbers. It's very small, subtle biases that actually come out over years of giving merit increases. So some of our best managers over 5 years would have very inequitable decisions, but you can only see those decisions over 5 years. So I think having early signals and tracing these other things around your employees where you can, and it's a lot to measure, for sure. That's a lot of pressure to put on. But I see that those proactive approaches lead to better outcomes because you can guide it more. And honestly, not too much of a shock to all of us, there's going to be a balance between discretion and pure algorithmic. Because if we can be purely algorithmic, we eliminate a lot of the bias, hopefully, right? There's other biases in like data and the genderization of titles and things like that. But when you add manager discretion in, you're gonna have more. So the more algorithmic I see go better, the ones who are measuring, like, are we leveling people at similar paces? Are we giving ratings at similar paces? Do we see trajectories, like people aren't spending, I just did a test for someone where we were looking, are women spending the same amount of time in a level as males? Like that goes to philosophy of promotion, but also are they leaving because they're spending 18 months in a level where the males are only spending 6 months before they move on. So interesting things like that, I think, lead to the outcome of more equitable programs because they're also interconnected.
So I would say that equitable compensation to me is consistent comp. That if you are doing the same type of work, you are getting comped in a similar way. It's hard to know. I would say a specific company that does that really well without knowing their payment information. But what I will say is, like, when we spent a lot of time at Pulley rolling out our compensation program, and I will say, as like the founder, I was like, should we really be spending this much time? There are so many other things. As a startup, it feels like you're on the verge of dying all the time. So should we be building other things and spending our time versus this? And what we actually found in hindsight is that it saved us so much time from having consistent policy. So one of the things we do is that we do equitable comp no matter where you live. Why do we do that? Because we didn't want to have the conversation on why is it that someone in San Francisco versus someone in Denver versus someone in India who's working on our time zone and doing exactly the same work is actually getting comped differently. And we didn't want to maintain over time 5 different tiers of locations and compensation based on that. So I think that maybe like one of the pushbacks you would get is that it's really hard to do equity comp if you're a smaller company. But I actually think that you can if you simplify and just be consistent in what you're trying to do.
Hi, my name is Reka. I've been in compensation and people analytics space for a while. Most recently, I was head of compensation and people analytics at Boss. And one of the things that we were obviously doing the pay equity studies, very frequently, it's not a point in time, one hiring decision, someone leaves, things can fall off balance. So we were doing that every quarter and things like that. But one of the things I tried to do was to provide more data around every hiring decision, every like one-off exception, retention grant, or any of those things that kind of throw off pay equity. So one of the things that we did is for both cash and RSUs, we found a way to have recruiters have access to obviously the full range, but also internal min-max, right? So what's the internal midpoint, what's the internal average? And there were some guidelines put in place that you can't go over 15% over the internal average, right? So that was another way that we were trying to get as equitable as possible on both cash and on equity, because based on the studies that I did is when you're making that one-off decision where someone's like, I have this counter offer and I'm leaving, if you don't give me something by tomorrow, and we don't have enough data. They'll go out to HRBP, for HRBP, gather all this information, there's this time pressure, and that's when we're making those non-calibrated one-off exception decisions and everything gets thrown off. So just bringing in as much data as possible and in the right time.
And I love this point. So with Pequity, our mission is fair pay and opportunity for all. And it goes back to a lot of what you're talking about, Reka, where whenever I was in-house, we're all trying to make good decisions. HR is really one team. The recruiters are trying to make great decisions and get this talent in, and they're on a time crunch, and they have managers who are like really upset because that talent's not here yesterday. And HR business partners who are trying to make sure that they stay and they're good and that they're competing with all these things. And somehow, which is why I founded Pequity, there was no system that like connected us all. Like we were in our ATS for recruiting, we're in our HRAS for HR business partners. Managers, I don't know where they're at. They're in spreadsheets that they downloaded and they hid away in their drive, and that's fine. And so having that central experience, I think, is important, which is part of pay transparency now, right? Like there was a time where I remember I had a lot of companies and a lot of leaders who were afraid to give recruiters access to peer medians. I was like, why? They're hiring them. They're just keeping secret spreadsheets and recording every single line. Like they know, they know what they're paid. And so I think the more that we can like embrace that, like transparency, not just for employees, but also for HR, and having systems that connect and communicate to each other, it's a really solid point that gets overlooked on like how do we operationalize it, and it does come down to system design, connection, having plugging for Pequity again, like sharing ranges through a tool, having recruiters have their own place where you can limit like what they see or not. Because I get we can't give everyone access to everything, but that's why you just need highly permissible systems.
I think we're at time almost, right? Do we have time for one more?
Yeah, let's do one more.
Okay. I have a hypothesis, right? So let's say I'm outside the U.S. and I'm applying to work for a job in the U.S. Previously, I didn't really have a lot of data of what that job pays, but with job descriptions telling me the salaries, now I have tons of data points. And even if companies in the U.S. have salary bands that are different for different countries and whatever, at the very least, I can ask for those U.S. ranges. So my hypothesis is outside the U.S., compensation, cost of labor is going to increase and approach what it's like in the United States. Agree or disagree?
I think, I mean, I would even say it's not an opinion. I think it's just factually correct. From what the data I think has actually shown for salaries outside the U.S., I think are starting to model within the U.S., even when you are living in an area where significantly lower cost of living. Because what I've also seen is that if you have a dev team, say in India, the best engineers there are actually getting comped really well. So it feels like maybe there was a period where you had a bit of an arbitrage if you were able to hire internationally, but post-COVID and more teams going remote and taking advantage of that arbitrage, it's slowly getting smaller and smaller.
We just launched a market survey, which, by the way, you guys are helping me out so much. My team's always like, you don't talk about the company enough. You're giving me great questions for this. But we started to collect some survey data from our companies to see like what's happening with pay at the moment. And we can see their geos, which is the important part, right? Like I can see which ranges they have and how many they apply. And what we are, like from my perspective, what we're seeing with our surveys, which is about 15,000 companies, 1 million data points, most industries covering UK, India, Southeast Asia, US predominantly. It's going to be very pocketed. And I actually think it makes a lot of sense. Like, there will always be geo differences. There will always be different local cost of labors. And the difference of whether people are being tied to that cost of labor or not, I find is if they have to operate from that region. And so if you think about janitorial staff being the most like simplest one for us to visualize, they have to be in a location. There's a very specific cost of labor for that kind of work. And they can't do that work anywhere. We need them to be at that spot to complete that task. Expanding that out to salespeople, for instance, if they're over a region, they need to be in that region. We might need them in a city. We might need them on foot. And so cost of labor, I think, will always have a place. Because the one thing that in the back of my head when I'm like, you know, Reddit or all these companies that did the pay the same rate everywhere, if you pay the same rate everywhere but you need someone in a location, how do you get them to go back to that expensive location if they got to keep that expensive salary when they left? Like their index just moved. So I think for roles that require you in a certain location, what we're seeing in the data so far, localized roles do have costs that are attached to that location, and so the geos for different regions maintain. But if there is a role that can be done anywhere, like engineering in particular, that is getting looser because they can do the same work anywhere, especially if they're willing to flex their hours, and that's becoming more of a globalized role. It's not localized. So I think if you look at a lot of the surveys, if you go into the Radfords, Mercers, whatever you're using, and you filter on these roles, you'll actually see that reflected in like the currency conversion portion. But you have to filter into that. If you do the global look, it's going to just look like everything's rising when I think it's really just these globalized roles driving up the market.
Awesome. Thank you, Yin and Caitlin. Would encourage you to continue the conversations out there. I think we've got a break now until 2:30. 30-minute break, yes. So coffee break, and we'll be back in here at 2:30.